Hello, welcome to the program. This is the Black Ponderer. I'm the host, Neil Trotter. The Black Ponderer is a YouTube channel where we talk about philosophy, we read philosophical texts, and we talk about philosophical themes within those texts. And today we're going to be talking about this text right here, another printout. It's called The Spiral of Violence. I guess I should fold it this, make it like an actual book. And it's by Hélder, Câmara. There's a guy right there. Okay, so this is actually a work of, I would say, social justice, political philosophy, also some theology in there for sure. This is, I'll just read you this, it's one of these books where they got a description of the author. Let me share with you. So, Hélder, Câmara. I don't speak Portuguese. I believe that's Portuguese. He's Archbishop of Olinda and Recife in the underdeveloped northeast of Brazil. So we've got Brazil, so Portuguese. Sorry for my pronunciation. Has caught the imagination of the world by his descriptions of the situation of the underdeveloped countries. In Brazil, he is denounced as a communist for asserting the official teaching of the church and lives in constant danger of assassination. In 1970, organizations in many countries nominated him for the Nobel Peace Prize because he is a proponent of nonviolence. So he's an activist, quite a prominent activist. This book is actually no longer published because it's just a bunch of papers. I'm holding it like a book, but the book is no longer published. You can't really buy it at a store anymore. So somebody uploaded their copy on the internet for free so people can access it. So that's pretty cool. And yeah, so what this book is about is, the title says it all, Spiral of Violence. So it's about the nature of violence, right? And so how do we deal with that nature? So like, what is violence? Or like, well, we know what violence is, but what is its nature? Like, how does violence perpetuate? Okay, now we're getting philosophical. How does it continue to persist, right? Many people would say like, oh, it's nature. People are just violent. There's aggressive people, and particularly men, right? And they are aggressive and they're violent, and that's just a part of nature. Violence is a part of nature, right? And so you just have to take it like that, right? And it's more about responding to violence with violence, and just like it's about whoever dominates more, and whoever is more violent is the one that wins, right? And this is the world we live in, where the author is saying we got to look at it from a different approach. Because violence operates like a spiral. Like, he doesn't even use the word cycle. Like, violence is cyclical, where you respond to violence with violence, and you just keep it going like this. But no, he's saying it's a spiral, a downward spiral. When violence happens to you and you respond in violence, it just keeps going down and down. It keeps getting worse and worse. The situation doesn't just repeat itself, it just spirals downward to a really bad situation. And to end this spiral downward, you have to respond with nonviolence, and then you could start the spiral will begin to go upward, right? And that's his argument, right? Rather than looking at violence as some natural phenomena, which one could say like, yeah, sure, violence is something that can happen when people succumb to their base emotions, right? That's something that can occur, which is kind of a natural thing. But we can act against those emotions, right? And we can respond differently because of our spirituality, right? And our awareness of ourselves, like our self-actualization. Humans in that way, I like to believe are different than like other animals. I mean, humans are animals, right? So we do have that, violent response to that flight or fight response, right? But we can kind of step back now and analyze the situation and respond maybe non-violently. Now, do we do that a lot of the time? No, but the author is challenging us to do that. So let me read you a quote, some quotes from the books, because that's how we roll here at the Black Ponderer. We read the actual text, quotes from the actual text. And then we respond via comments, my comments and your comments on the comment section here on the video down below. And we talk and we have a dialogue and we have a discussion. So this is page 38 in case you want to download the book. I think you should just literally just type the author and the title and you'll get the book. It's free if you would like to do so. This is page 38. This is the third paragraph. The author says, no clear signs of change are to be seen in the structures of any developed country in the capitalist camp. Okay? And then, in parentheses, the socialist camp also has grave problems, as will one day be seen. The rich will accept talk of aid for those of their own country and even for the third world. But it is not done to talk too much about justice, rights, structural changes. And that's definitely like a thing that he brings up. And today we talk about that, where we talk about how like discrimination, oppression, violence, exploitation, how are these things really operating? They're operating structurally, right? They're operating systemically. They're part of a industrial system. Sure, there's a lot of individual acting going on, where there's individual violent acts, but what causes the true harm and the most damage is the systemic influences, like countries, nations, right? Governments operating as a structure, as a system against people or peoples. And so if you want to talk about aid, right, we need to talk about not just aiding individual people, we got to start dealing with these damaging structures, these institutions. And I skip down 8 lines here. Aid is necessary, but not enough. Until someone has the courage and intelligence to undertake a complete revision of international trade policy, the poor countries will continue to get poorer and to enrich the wealthy countries more and more. We look at the current situation now in current affairs, right? With all these wars going on, let's say the war between Russia and Ukraine and the war against Hamas and the state of Israel, and how like the United States takes this position of, oh, we got to send aid to Ukraine, or we have to send aid to the people who are the innocent citizens who are suffering in Gaza, which is important, right? But and the author even says like it's necessary, but it's not enough. We often stop there and there, where we send the aid, as countries will send aid to other countries or threaten people, and then it just stops there. It's like, okay, but what are we actually going to do to address the institutional problem, like the structural problem of war itself, right? And this is where you get into these points about, hashtag ceasefire, right? Where you start talking about, for example, the state of Israel being this exploitative state that exploits the people of Palestine. And until you address that issue, like you can send all the aid in the world, it's never going to change. The situation will always be a violent situation, right? Of course, you got to address that immediate problem of people suffering, and we're using the current situation with Hamas versus the state of Israel as an example, this war that's going on. But you can extend that example to all types of wars that are going on currently. There's so many, sadly. The war in Ukraine as well, for example, right? That's another big hot button issue. Oh, we have to send aid to Ukraine, but we have to take a step. Also, we have to think about, okay, why does this keep happening? Why is these wars keep occurring? Right? What do we have to do in the long term to stop war from happening in these countries? And that's what this author is trying to get us to think about. Now you might say, again, as I mentioned before, you might say to yourself, well, people are just violent. There are going to be people who are going to use violence to enforce their power or try to get power through violence, right? So war is just this necessary evil that we just have to deal with. But the author, Câmara, he challenges that notion. He's like, well, let's think about this more deeply. And he says here on page 41, right, is armed violence the only solution? When humanity is under the threat of being engulfed in violence and hatred, we have no right to confront ourselves with illusions, to reassure ourselves with pseudo-solutions, whose main drawback is to distract our attention from the difficult and daring solutions which are perhaps the true ones. So what does he mean? Pseudo-solutions or illusions. You know, the illusion that war is this thing that's going to result in something good, right? War is this glorious action that is like this necessary horror, and when the good guys do the war, then you're going to end up with a good result, and then, you know, peace will be obtained, etc., etc. And this is just not the case, right? One war just leads to another war. And the war that began is more vicious that the next war follows. This is violence spiral that goes on. And we see this, right? The two examples I just used, the Ukraine versus Russia, that has been an ongoing issue for decades, right? We're just seeing the latest manifestation, which is a very horrible one, right? It's just keeps spiraling down because it's just war after war after war. Same thing with the issue between Palestine and Israel, right? That whole issue, right? That is a decade long, centuries long. You know, if you want to even go further and talk about the ancestors of these current peoples, I mean, that situation that's been going on in the Middle East, I mean, there's references in the Bible about that, right? And it's just war after war and a war, and this is just the latest manifestation of that spiral of violence. The author writes, let us have the courage to ask ourselves, does not non-violent action serve as a tranquilizer? You gotta have that courage, right? To be, you know, to respond to the person that's like, look, people are people. People are violent. There's always gonna be these nutcases that are gonna use violence against us, and so we have to be violent back, right? But that's an auto response. We're even conditioned through, you know, I would argue propaganda or you know, media, where we glorify war and we're like, you know, there are good and just wars. So there's this concept of, oh, you know, people are so brave because they have to go and fight the violence with the violence. You know, they got to go risk their lives, which is, you know, I'm not knocking veterans or war people who are involved in war trying to protect themselves, but we have to ask ourselves, is that like, does that really work? Like, does that really end in peace or long-lasting peace? And the answer, if you just look at history, clearly no. There's a problem here, right? We have to really have the courage to really think about, okay, how can we actually create peace that is a sustainable peace? How can we get over this notion of war is just this thing that's just going to happen? Like, is that really the case? You know, or are we just going to succumb to this propaganda that's been fed to us? These illusions, these pseudo solutions, right? And we're just going to constantly be swept up in this spiral of violence throughout the ages. I shall read you this quote here on page 50. It's about the middle of the page. Do not let us deceive ourselves. The socialist empires, whether of Soviet or Chinese allegiance, are just as cold and insensible as the capitalist empires towards the underdeveloped countries' hope for total development. The capitalist empires, with their affirmation of sacrifice for the free world, you know, the whole like glorification of war, just wars, the Great War, right? Of defense of private enterprise, of safeguarding order from subversion and chaos, are in fact defending their political prestige and the economic interests arising from it. They are indeed at the service of economic power and the international trust, also known as imperialism. Right. Now, the socialist empires, for their part, are hard and intransigent. They do not allow pluralism. They impose dialectical materialism, this Marxist term. Check out my videos about Marx, about Marxist texts to know about that. But you know, it's just a theoretical concept, right? They impose dialectical materialism, demand blind obedience to the party, set up a regime of total and permanent insecurity and fear, just like the fascist dictatorships of the extreme right. The author considers himself a communist. He's for like true communism or true socialism, at least. But he's looking at these countries or these nations who declare themselves as communists, and he's like, they're just as bad as the capitalists. Because, I mean, ultimately what's going on is they're using violence to enforce their power. And so they're continually caught in a spiral of violence, just as bad as all the capitalist countries are. And so there's this more fundamental problem, right? Before we can begin to talk about like communism versus capitalism, you know, versus socialism, before that discussion is undertaken, right? We have to talk about the issue of violence and how violence used to enforce your will onto somebody or one's will onto people, that just doesn't work. Or rather, it works in a way that just generates more violence. And it's not even cyclical, like it's not the same, the violence just spirals downward and it multiplies and it gets worse. How then do we use nonviolence to end the spiral of violence? Go check out page 54 at the last line here. Everywhere, as well as an inert majority and an extreme left and an extreme right who clash with one another in a shifting balance of violence and hatred, there are minorities who are well aware that violence is not the real answer to violence. That if violence is met by violence, the world will fall into a spiral of violence. That the only true answer to violence is to have the courage to face the injustices which constitute violence. Okay, so what does he say? Okay, there's many things being said in this paragraph. So he's saying like, look, there's these 4 categories of people. Right? He kind of like breaks it down, these 4 categories of people. There's like the extreme left, right? And then there's the extreme right. And both the extreme left and the extreme right are just using violence to respond to violence, right? And that's not going anywhere, but bad, right? Then there's this inert majority who sees this, who looks at it, who are not part of the extreme left or right, but they're seeing each side doing this, caught up in this violence spiral, and they're like, I don't know where to go. I don't want to be a part of that, or you know. And so, like the author is like, we need to appeal to those people who are looking at the extreme left and the extreme right. The extreme left and the extreme right. You know, kind of remember my camera is flipped, right? And they just trying to figure out what to do. So then there's this 4th kind of person, is what he's saying, is those who have the courage to call out this BS, who say like, look, we got to stop responding to violence with violence. What we got to do is we have to face the injustices which constitute violence. And what does that mean? Well, we gotta look at the world socio-economically and systemically and see that our problems are our institutions, right? It's not so much like evil people, you know. Of course, like evil people are behind these institutions, but blowing up evil people is not, because the institution is gonna remain, right? We gotta address the societal structures that are upholding these systems of violence. I put in my notes here, I circled inert majority, and I put, most are aware of the absurdity of violence, but are stifled to put that awareness into action by our systems of oppression, right? So what am I saying, systems of oppression? I'm saying the normalization of violence through like our media, right? Through movies, television shows, even in the way history is taught. You know, I mentioned before, I'll say it again, the banning of books. Where I live, the state of Tennessee here in America, the United States. I mean, just recently we were celebrating Memorial Day, and it was like I think the 80th anniversary of D-Day, And, the whole idea of, D-Day being this glorious demonstration of courage and sacrifice, which, it's horrible, like what happened and the amount of people that died. And then we're like sold this illusion, this myth, I'll tell you straight up, this myth of, they died for our freedoms. We have the freedom because of their violent sacrifice. And it's like, yeah, but the United States of America still suffers from tremendous social inequality, right? Which we don't even want to talk about. Right? We'd rather skip over all that, right? A lot of these Americans can't even vote because of social inequities, right? They can't even participate in the rights that these people who died fought for. And, we can just keep going on and on. Really, we should be looking at that D-Day is this tragedy, this human tragedy. Really, that's pretty much all that it is. And that's not to belittle the people who died fighting that day, right? It's really to belittle the institutions and situations and the structures that enabled that day to happen in the way that it did. Those are the true perpetuators of horror. And we need to look at it within that frame, right? And so that's what I'm saying this is the fourth kind of person, the people who are just calling out the BS and letting people know, it doesn't have to be this way, right? We need to start addressing the structures that are put in place that force us or push us toward violence when violence happens to us. We don't have to react in that way, but our structures are heavily designed so that we do act that way, and that's the problem. Henceforth, we're always going to be trapped in this cycle, this spiral of violence. But let me continue with the quote here. The privileged and the authorities will come to understand that common sense obliges one to choose between bloody and armed violence on the one hand, and on the other, the violence of the peaceful, liberating moral pressure. So, it's kind of like the whole concept of the court of public opinion, where it's if we can demonstrate that nonviolence is actually what's most effective, if we can demonstrate this, if we can kind of encourage people that, yeah, it is absurd what's going on. The fact that we're just responding to violence with violence and it just creates more violence. And we think that's the norm. That's absurd, right? If we could just start responding to violence in a way that's nonviolent, and by doing that is we got to actually attack the systems and the structures, the societal structures that are put in place. And we're talking about the military-industrial complex and, state powers that exploit other peoples so that they can get economic gain. I'm talking about imperialism, that whole state structure, capitalism, but also socialism gone awry, socialism that's enforced through authoritarianism. It's also a violent means of asserting power, which also creates a spiral of violence, right? If we start addressing those issues and say, hey, you know what, we're not gonna go down this path, right? It stops here. The buck stops here, right? That's how we end the spiraling downward. But easier said than done, right? How do we do it? Well, the author has some things to say about that. This is page 76. Is there room for conflict? Obviously. If action for justice and peace does not set itself up as a sign of contradiction, if it does not provoke disquiet, if it does not sow doubts, if it does not arouse great devotion and provoke hatred, then it is preparing its own funeral. It does not claim to be the solution. It hopes to help men at a time when all of us are groping for a way out. Okay, so he said, look, can we just talk about this, right? Can we put our heads together and figure out nonviolent ways of addressing the problem, right? He's not even saying I don't have the solution, but can we at least talk about it and not just completely dismiss it in this whole idea or notion look, people are violent. Violence is just something that exists. Deal with it, When somebody rages war on you, you respond with war. You just multiply that war times 2. right? The person that wins is the one who is most violent, right? The one that dominates the most is the one that succeeds, right? The losers are the ones that we can subordinate the most, right? And once we escape that whole framework, that ideological, philosophical framework, if we get out of that and start thinking like, maybe there's another way, because this way obviously is not working, as we see in history, right? As we see with the continued violence happening throughout the world. As you see, just turn on the news and you can see that this type of way we're doing things is not working. So what do we do, right? And he continues. The important thing is to get started. Time is pressing. We are hundreds of years behind, and all of us bear direct responsibility for the sin of omission, right? All right. So we just got to start. Right? You got to start with the nonviolence. You got to be like, wow, that's preposterous. How could you possibly think that that's gonna work? It's like, well, we're behind. Like, the world's going to shit, and we're using violence to try and solve these problems, and we're just going into more shit, right? There's got to be another way, and there is another way. We just got to be courageous enough to approach it in this alternative way, this way of nonviolence. And how do we do that, right? Well, there's many, many ways, right? I have videos that talk about all types of alternative methods to solving our problems. I think philosophy is a great tool we can use to organize our social justice activism, like our political activism, in a positive way. I'm talking about abolition, right? Abolition, abolishing police, prisons, and surveillance, right? Which I've had several videos about. That's a method. I'm talking about feminism, right? And not that second wave turf feminism. I'm talking about like third wave, not just even gender equality, but thinking outside the binary of masculine, feminine, like understanding the diversity of human existence beyond this man or female dichotomy, right? Which is like this dominant, subordinate type of existence, right? Once we escape that, right, then we can begin to start getting out of this spiral of violence, and so on and so forth. I have many, many videos on this. Check them out. But we got to talk about it. Like, do I have all the answers? No. But we do got a lot of answers, right? A lot of answers are out there. A lot of intelligent, smart people have not only thought of these ideas, put these ideas into action, and are working. But the way these ideas are implemented are being banned, right? You can't even read about them anymore. You can't talk about them because people will call you woke in a derogatory term. To be called woke ideology. You see like the backlash that's happening, right? When you start bringing these things up. But we gotta have the courage to just continue the discussion about how to implement nonviolence in a way that gets us out of the spiral of violence. So check it out. The book is free on the internet. It's Spiral of Violence. It's by Hélder, Câmara. Well, you've been watching the Black Ponderer. Tune in next time for more philosophical thought.